There is a stretch of shoreline on the north shore of Long Island where the earth remembers extravagance. Here, between the waters of Long Island Sound and the rolling hills that once harbored farms and modest estates, the wealthiest families in America built a kingdom of their own making. They called it many things, but history would come to know it as the Gold Coast, a glittering crescent of privilege that flourished in the decades surrounding the turn of the 20th century. This was not merely a place where rich people lived. It was a deliberate construction, an entire society built on principles of beauty, leisure, and the careful maintenance of social boundaries. The families who settled here possessed fortunes so vast that their names became synonymous with American capitalism itself: Vanderbilt, Astor, Morgan, Whitney, Guggenheim. They were industrialists and financiers, railroad magnates and inheritors of shipping empires, and they came to Long Island's North Shore seeking something that money could buy only in limited quantities: privacy and space to display their wealth without restraint. What they created has fascinated generations since. The estates they built were not simply large homes but complete worlds unto themselves, with architecture borrowed from European palaces, gardens designed by masters, and staff numbering in the dozens. The life they lived there seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time, a carefully choreographed performance of elegance that required constant attention and considerable expense to maintain. Tonight, we'll walk through that vanished world, examining not just the mansions and the money, but the daily texture of life as it was lived by those who occupied the very pinnacle of American society during its Gilded Age and into the early decades of the 20th century. We'll explore what they built, how they spent their days, the rules that governed their behavior, and ultimately, what became of it all. Let us begin where they began, with the land itself, and the question of why this particular stretch of Long Island became the chosen ground for such concentrated wealth. Before the mansions rose, before the Vanderbilts and Astors arrived with their architects and landscape designers, the North Shore of Long Island was a place of quiet farming communities and modest wealth. The land rolled gently from the spine of the island down to the waters of Long Island Sound, creating natural terraces that would later prove perfect for grand estates. The soil was decent enough for agriculture, though not remarkable, and small harbors dotted the coastline where fishing boats and local trade vessels came and went with the tides. What changed everything was proximity and the railroad. By the 1880s, the expansion of rail service from New York City had begun to transform what had been a journey of several hours by horse and carriage into a comfortable train ride of under 2 hours. For the first time, wealthy New Yorkers could maintain substantial country estates within practical reach of their business interests in Manhattan. This was the key that unlocked the Gold Coast, the ability to escape the summer heat and urban congestion of the city without genuinely leaving the sphere of influence where fortunes were made and managed. The geography itself offered considerable advantages. Unlike the flat expanses of other potential suburban retreats, the North Shore provided variety and drama in its landscape. Hills allowed for commanding views across the Sound toward Connecticut. Natural harbors could accommodate the yachts that were becoming essential accessories for families of means. The existing villages, places like Glen Cove, Oyster Bay, and Locust Valley, possessed charming historic character without being so established as to resist transformation by newcomers with money and ambition. Perhaps most importantly, the area offered something increasingly rare in the rapidly industrializing America of the late 19th century, a sense of remove from the consequences of the very industries that had generated such spectacular wealth. The factories, the tenements, the labor disputes, the grime and noise of industrial production, all of this could be left behind in the city. On the Gold Coast, one could enjoy the fruits of capitalism while inhabiting a landscape that suggested older, more pastoral forms of wealth and leisure. The first wave of estate builders arrived in the 1880s and 1890s, establishing a pattern that others would follow. They purchased large tracts of land, often hundreds of acres, ensuring both privacy and the space necessary for the elaborate grounds they envisioned. These early estates set standards of scale and grandeur that subsequent arrivals felt compelled to match or exceed, creating a kind of architectural arms race where each new mansion had to make a statement commensurate with its owner's position in society. By the turn of the century, the transformation was well underway. Farmland that had sold for modest prices only years before now commanded premium rates. Local residents found themselves living alongside or working for some of the most powerful families in the nation. The character of the North Shore changed fundamentally, from a quiet agricultural and maritime region to something unprecedented in American life, a concentrated enclave of aristocratic pretension built entirely on industrial and financial wealth. The appeal was not merely practical or aesthetic. There was something psychological at work as well. The Gilded Age rich sought legitimacy for their relatively new fortunes, and European aristocracy provided the most readily available model. By building estates that echoed English country houses or French chateaux, by adopting the pastimes and social rituals of European nobility, American industrialists could transform themselves, at least in their own minds and social circles, from the makers of money into something resembling hereditary gentility. The Gold Coast became a stage for this transformation, a place where one's surroundings could suggest lineages and traditions that did not, in fact, exist. And so they came, family after family, each purchasing their piece of paradise, each hiring architects to design structures that would announce their arrival into the highest ranks of American society. What they built would be extraordinary, but perhaps more fascinating than the buildings themselves was the life that unfolded within them. A life governed by unwritten rules and dedicated to the pursuit of a very particular kind of perfection. The mansions that rose along the Gold Coast were not homes in any ordinary sense. They were statements rendered in stone, brick, and marble, each one a carefully considered announcement of its owner's wealth, taste, and position. To understand the world of the Gold Coast is to understand these structures, not merely as buildings but as instruments of social ambition and personal expression on a scale that few other places or times in American history have witnessed. Consider Oheka Castle, the creation of Otto Hermann Kahn, a financier and philanthropist who came to embody the possibilities of Gold Coast life. Completed in 1919, Oheka required 4 years of construction and stood as the second largest private residence in America, surpassed only by the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina. The mansion contained 127 rooms spread across 109,000 square feet. The name itself, Oheka, was derived from Kahn's initials, a detail that suggests the deeply personal nature of these grand projects. What makes Oheka particularly instructive is not merely its size but the comprehensiveness of its vision. The architect, Delano and Aldrich, designed the building in the French chateau style, creating a structure that would have looked entirely at home in the Loire Valley. The interiors featured rooms of state suitable for entertaining on a grand scale, including a ballroom that could accommodate 200 guests, a library, a music room, and an array of bedrooms and suites for family and guests. But beyond the main house lay the true measure of the estate, formal gardens designed by the Olmsted brothers, descendants of Frederick Law Olmsted, who created Central Park, stretching across 443 acres of landscaped grounds. The creation of such an estate was itself an industrial undertaking. For Oheka, workers moved earth to reshape the natural topography, created artificial lakes, planted thousands of trees and shrubs, and built miles of roads and pathways. The project required its own power plant, water system, and small army of staff to maintain once completed. This pattern repeated across the Gold Coast, each great estate becoming a kind of self-contained world with its own infrastructure and small community of employees. Architecture styles varied according to the tastes and aspirations of each owner. The Vanderbilt family favored grandeur that echoed their railroad empire's scale. William K. Vanderbilt's idle hour in Oakdale and his various family estates demonstrated a preference for ostentatious display, mixing architectural elements with a confidence that bordered on audacity. The Guggenheim family, with wealth derived from mining and smelting, built fillets, A house that perched on a cliff overlooking the Sound, its Norman-style architecture suggesting medieval fortifications softened by careful landscaping. Not all estates reached for European models. Some owners, particularly those with deeper American roots or stronger nationalist sentiments, commissioned colonial revival designs that referenced America's own architectural heritage. These mansions, though perhaps less theatrical than their chateau-inspired neighbors, were no less substantial or expensive. The choice of style became itself a form of communication, a way of signaling one's values and self-conception to the other families of the Gold Coast. The architects who designed these estates became celebrities in their own right. Besides Delano and Aldrich, names like Stamford White, John Russell Pope, and Carrere and Hastings appeared repeatedly in Gold Coast projects. These men understood that they were not simply designing homes, but creating settings for a particular way of life. Every detail mattered, from the placement of windows to maximize views, to the configuration of service areas that would allow staff to move invisibly through the house, to the proportions of rooms intended for specific social rituals. Inside these mansions, the craftsmanship reached levels rarely seen in American domestic architecture. Entire rooms might be paneled in rare woods imported from distant continents. Ceilings bore elaborate plasterwork or painted murals by recognized artists. Floors featured intricate parquet or marble in geometric patterns. Fireplaces, often numerous throughout a single house, became showcases for sculptural mantels in stone or carved wood. Every surface offered an opportunity for decoration, and estate owners rarely declined the opportunity. The grounds surrounding these houses received attention equal to the buildings themselves. The Olmsted Brothers firm, along with other prominent landscape architects, created gardens that combined formal European traditions with the natural beauty of the Long Island landscape. Terraced gardens descended hillsides in careful geometric arrangements. Rose gardens, reflecting pools, classical statuary, and carefully sited gazebos created a series of outdoor rooms, each with its own character and purpose. Some estates included working farms, not from necessity but as picturesque additions to the landscape, offering views of pastoral agriculture without the actual labor or inconvenience that true farming would entail. The construction and maintenance of these estates pumped enormous amounts of money into the local Long Island economy. Armies of craftsmen, gardeners, and laborers found employment, while local businesses supplied everything from food to furnishings. Yet there was something curious about this economic impact. It created prosperity without creating equality. The workers who built and maintained these estates remained firmly outside the world they sustained, living in nearby towns and villages that existed in a different social universe despite their physical proximity. As mansion after mansion rose along the North Shore, the Gold Coast took on its characteristic appearance, a landscape of high walls, long driveways, and glimpses of grand architecture half hidden by trees. It became its own kind of territory, neither truly rural nor urban, but something unique, a carefully constructed environment designed to facilitate a specific vision of the good life as understood by those who possessed nearly unlimited means. Behind the imposing facades and manicured grounds, life on the Gold Coast followed patterns as carefully structured as the gardens themselves. To be wealthy in this time and place meant submitting to an elaborate set of expectations about how one should spend one's days, with whom, and according to what rituals. The freedom that money could buy was, paradoxically, a freedom to live within very specific constraints that marked one as belonging to the highest levels of society. The day began differently depending on whether the family was in residence for the social season or enjoying a quieter period of actual relaxation. During the height of the season, roughly from spring through autumn, each day followed a careful schedule that balanced leisure with social obligation. Breakfast might be served in one's room or in a morning room, a relatively informal affair by Gold Coast standards, though still involving multiple courses and the attendance of servants. For the men of these households, the morning often meant at least a token engagement with the business interests that funded this elaborate lifestyle. Many maintained offices in Manhattan, and would make the journey by private rail car or chauffeur-driven automobile several days a week. Others conducted business from home offices, communicating by telephone and telegraph with managers who handled day-to-day operations. The gentleman's relationship with business was complicated. It was understood that someone had to attend to the making of money, but too close an association with commerce could be seen as vulgar. The ideal was to appear as if one's wealth simply existed, requiring minimal attention to maintain. For the women, mornings involved their own forms of work, the management of the household, and the planning of social activities. Running a Gold Coast estate was genuinely complicated, requiring coordination of dozens of servants, maintenance of extensive grounds, and the constant preparation for guests. The lady of the house might spend morning hours with her head housekeeper and chef, planning menus for upcoming entertainments, reviewing household accounts, and addressing any issues that had arisen among the staff. Afternoons offered more variety. This was the time for leisure activities that often required specific facilities and equipment. Many estates included their own tennis courts, and tennis parties became popular social events where guests could engage in moderate exercise while maintaining conversation and social connection. Golf, introduced to America in the late 19th century, became another favored pastime, with several grand clubs established on or near the Gold Coast where members could play on courses designed by renowned architects. For those inclined toward equestrian pursuits, the Gold Coast offered extraordinary opportunities. Many estates maintained substantial stables with horses for riding and hunting. Fox hunting, borrowed directly from English tradition despite the questionable abundance of foxes on Long Island, became a regular activity complete with formal dress, specific protocols, and the social hierarchies inherent in such organized sport. The Meadow Brook Hunt Club, established in 1881, became one of the centers of this activity, with hunts that might draw dozens of participants and require coordination across multiple estates. The water beckoned constantly. Yachting emerged as perhaps the preeminent sport of the Gold Coast, combining substantial expense with genuine skill and offering opportunities for both competition and leisure cruising. The New York Yacht Club maintained a station at Glen Cove, and many families owned vessels that ranged from substantial sailing yachts to steam-powered pleasure craft that could accommodate extended cruises. Yacht racing became intensely competitive, with families investing not just in vessels but in professional crews to sail them. As afternoon turned to evening, attention shifted to the central activity of Gold Coast life, elaborate social gathering. Dinner parties, balls, and other entertainments formed the heart of the season, and the preparation for these events could be extraordinarily complex. Guest lists had to be carefully managed according to social compatibility and hierarchy. Menus required planning that balanced impressiveness with current fashion in cuisine. Entertainment, whether musical performances, theatrical presentations, or simply conversation, needed to be arranged. The dinners themselves followed strict protocols. Guests dressed formally, men in white tie and tails, women in elaborate gowns with appropriate jewelry. Seating arrangements followed complex rules based on social precedents, and the need to create interesting conversation pairings. Multiple courses, often numbering 8 or more, would be served over several hours, each accompanied by appropriate wines selected from cellars that might contain thousands of bottles. Servants moved with practiced precision, presenting and clearing courses with minimal intrusion into the guest's experience. After dinner, the evening might continue with entertainment in music rooms or ballrooms. Some families employed small orchestras for dancing. Others hosted theatrical performances, sometimes with professional actors, sometimes with guests participating in amateur theatricals that had been carefully rehearsed. Card games offered another form of evening entertainment, though the stakes involved could be significant, and a gentleman's card debts were considered sacred obligations. Weekends might bring house parties, extended gatherings where guests stayed for several days, participating in a program of activities organized by their hosts. These events required even more elaborate planning and showcased an estate's facilities. Guests might arrive Friday evening and remain through Sunday afternoon, participating in morning rides, afternoon sports, formal dinners, and various forms of evening entertainment. The house party became a crucial social institution, allowing families to strengthen alliances, introduce young people to appropriate potential matches, and generally maintain the social networks that sustained their position. Throughout all of this, servants remained ever present but carefully invisible. The smooth functioning of Gold Coast life depended entirely on their labor, yet the ideal was that guests should never notice the work being done on their behalf. Food appeared as if by magic. Rooms were cleaned and refreshed without anyone seeing the process. Personal valets and ladies' maids ensured that their employers were always appropriately dressed and groomed. The staff itself maintained its own hierarchy and social structure, mirroring in miniature the world of those they served. This choreography of leisure required its own kind of discipline. One had to know the unwritten rules, the appropriate dress for each occasion, the correct forms of address, the proper behavior toward equals, superiors, and inferiors. Violations could be socially fatal, marking one as not truly belonging to this rarefied world. The result was a life that, for all its privilege and luxury, operated within remarkably narrow confines, a gilded cage perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. The physical architecture of the Gold Coast found its mirror in an equally elaborate social architecture, a structure of rules and expectations that determined who belonged and who did not, what behavior was acceptable and what marked one as an outsider. Understanding this social dimension is essential to understanding the world of the Gold Coast, for the mansions and wealth were ultimately in service of creating and maintaining social distinction. At the apex of this structure stood the concept of society with a capital S, a self-selecting group that recognized each other as peers and maintained boundaries against those they deemed unsuitable. Admission to society was not automatic even for the wealthy. New fortunes, particularly those made in industries considered ungenteel, might require a generation or more to be fully accepted. The established families of older wealth, those whose money came from shipping or early railroad investments, looked with varying degrees of skepticism on those whose fortunes derived from more recent industrial ventures. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the famed Mrs. Astor, had established in New York City the idea that society could be numerically defined. Her ballroom could accommodate 400 people, and thus, the 400 became shorthand for those who truly mattered in New York's social world. This concept extended to the Gold Coast, though with some modifications. Here, the barriers were somewhat more permeable, as the very act of building a magnificent estate and maintaining it properly could serve as a form of application for social recognition. Social calling cards played a crucial role in this system. The ritual of calling, where one family would visit another according to specific protocols, served as a mechanism for maintaining social networks and signaling status. Cards left, received, and returned functioned as a kind of social currency. To not return a call could be a deliberate snub, a way of indicating that social relations would not be pursued. Conversely, the pattern of who called on whom mapped the actual structure of social relationships with considerable precision. The social season itself was carefully delineated. Spring through autumn saw the Gold Coast come alive with activity, as families decamped from their New York City residences to spend months at their estates. Winter often meant returning to the city, or for some, heading to other fashionable locales like Palm Beach or the French Riviera. This pattern of seasonal migration was itself a marker of belonging, those truly wealthy enough to maintain multiple residences and move between them according to an established calendar. Marriage occupied a central position in this social architecture, serving as the primary mechanism for maintaining or advancing family position. Young people of Gold Coast families understood that their marriages were not entirely personal matters but carried implications for family alliances and the preservation of wealth. Parents took active roles in introducing their children to appropriate potential partners, often through carefully managed social events and house parties. The institution of the debutante ball formalized this process for young women. Upon reaching appropriate age, usually 17 or 18, a young woman would be formally introduced to society at an elaborate ball or series of balls. This marked her availability for courtship and began her career as a full participant in social life. The presentation had to be done correctly, with appropriate dress, behavior, and sponsorship. A successful debut could set the trajectory for a young woman's entire life, while a failed one could be socially devastating. Exclusion operated as the essential mechanism that gave the entire system meaning. Not everyone could be admitted, or the distinction of belonging would lose its value. Religious prejudice played a significant role, particularly anti-Semitism, with many clubs and social organizations explicitly or implicitly excluding Jewish families regardless of their wealth. This prejudice existed in tension with the reality that some of the great Gold Coast estates belonged to Jewish families like the Guggenheims and Otto Kahn, creating a complicated landscape where exceptional wealth might create exceptions to otherwise rigid rules. The clubs that dotted the Gold Coast served as crucial gatekeepers of social belonging. The Piping Rock Club, founded in 1911, became one of the most exclusive social and sporting clubs in America, with membership by invitation only and a waiting list that included many who would never actually be admitted. Similar institutions, from golf clubs to yacht clubs to hunting clubs, each maintained their own membership standards and served as venues where the social hierarchy could be performed and reinforced. Race represented another absolute boundary. The world of the Gold Coast was entirely white, with people of color appearing only as servants or in other service roles. This racial exclusion was so complete and so assumed that it rarely required explicit articulation. The very concept of society as understood by Gold Coast families implicitly meant white society, and any challenge to this assumption would have been inconceivable to the families who lived there. Class barriers, though more permeable than racial ones, remained formidable. The merchants, skilled craftsmen, and professionals who lived in the nearby towns and villages existed in a different social universe despite their geographical proximity and economic connections to the estates. Social mixing occurred only in specifically defined contexts, usually transactional, where the relationship between employer and employee or buyer and seller was clear. The children of Gold Coast families and the children of local townspeople might live only miles apart but would grow up with almost no social contact. Within the acceptable boundaries of society, however, more subtle hierarchies operated. Old money looked down on new money, even as new money often possessed greater actual wealth. Families whose fortunes derived from finance considered themselves superior to those whose wealth came from manufacturing, despite the fact that both were fundamentally engaged in capitalism. English ancestry conferred more prestige than other national origins. These fine distinctions mattered enormously to those navigating this social world, even as they might seem absurd or incomprehensible to outsiders. The elaborate nature of these social rules served several purposes. Most obviously, they created and maintained distinction, ensuring that wealth alone was not sufficient for social position. But they also provided structure and meaning to lives that otherwise might have seemed purposeless. For people who did not need to work, who had servants to handle every practical concern, the social world became their occupation. Navigating its complexities, maintaining one's position, advancing one's family's interests, these activities filled time and provided a sense of achievement and purpose. Yet there was something ultimately fragile about this entire structure. It rested on the continuation of extreme wealth inequality, on the assumption that American society would remain sufficiently stratified to support such elaborate hierarchy. It depended on consensus among the wealthy about what mattered and how to behave. And it required that those excluded accept their exclusion, or at least lack the power to challenge it effectively. As we will see, these foundations would prove less stable than those who lived within this system imagined. Behind every perfect dinner party, every immaculate garden, every moment of leisure enjoyed by the families of the Gold Coast, lay the labor of dozens or even hundreds of servants. To understand the Gold Coast only through the experience of those who own the estates is to see merely half the picture, and perhaps not the more interesting half. The servants' world existed in parallel with that of their employers, occupying the same physical spaces but experiencing them through entirely different perspectives. A large Gold Coast estate might employ 50 to 100 servants in a complex hierarchy of roles and responsibilities. At the top stood the butler, who managed the male staff and oversaw the formal service of meals and the maintenance of wine cellars and silver. The housekeeper, his female equivalent, managed the maids and oversaw the cleaning and maintenance of the house itself. These two positions represented the height of domestic service, requiring not just skill but also judgment, discretion, and the ability to manage others effectively. Below this level, positions proliferated with increasing specialization. A chef and kitchen staff might number 10 or more people, from sous chefs to scullery maids, each with specific responsibilities in the production of the elaborate meals that Gold Coast life required. Personal servants, including ladies' maids and valets, attended to the individual needs of family members, helping with dressing, maintaining clothing, and often serving as confidants and companions. Footmen provided formal service at meals and events, chosen as much for their height and appearance as for their skills, as they contributed to the visual spectacle of formal entertaining. Housemaids faced perhaps the most physically demanding work, responsible for the constant cleaning required to maintain these vast houses. Rising before the family, they would light fires, clean grates, dust, sweep, and polish their way through dozens of rooms. The labor was relentless, as the standards were impossibly high. A trace of dust, a smudge on a mirror, a carpet not perfectly aligned, these small failings could result in reprimand or dismissal. Outside, the staff multiplied further. Gardeners maintained the elaborate grounds, a task requiring genuine expertise in horticulture and landscape management. Grooms and stable hands cared for horses and maintained carriages and later automobiles. Chauffeurs emerged as new positions as cars became common, requiring a different skill set that combined mechanical knowledge with driving ability and the presentation skills expected of all servants who interacted directly with the family or guests. The working conditions for these servants varied considerably. Some employers treated their staff with genuine consideration, providing comfortable quarters, decent food, and respectful management. Others viewed servants as interchangeable and easily replaceable, enforcing harsh discipline and maintaining attitudes of casual cruelty. The unpredictability of treatment was itself a source of stress, as a servant's quality of life depended heavily on the personality and values of those they served. Living arrangements reflected the social hierarchy. Senior servants like butlers and housekeepers often had private rooms, sometimes quite comfortable. Lower-level servants might share cramped quarters in attics or basements, with minimal privacy and basic furnishings. The physical separation of servants' quarters from family spaces was carefully maintained, with back stairs and hallways allowing staff to move through the house without being seen by family or guests. This architectural segregation reinforced social divisions, creating parallel circulation systems within a single building. Pay varied as widely as conditions. A skilled butler or housekeeper at a major estate might earn several $100s per year, a respectable working-class income for the time. Entry-level positions might pay as little as $10 or $15 per month plus room and board. For many servants, particularly immigrants, even these modest wages represented opportunity, a chance to save money and perhaps eventually establish independent lives. For others, service became a lifetime career, with the hope of gradually advancing to more senior and better-paid positions. The relationship between servants and employers operated according to unwritten but clearly understood rules. Deference was expected at all times. Servants were to be invisible when possible, present only when needed, and always respectful in manner and speech. Speaking unless spoken to, offering unsolicited opinions, or showing any sign of presuming equality could result in immediate dismissal. Yet within these constraints, individual relationships could develop, particularly between personal servants and those they attended. Ladies' maids might become trusted companions to the women they served, privy to secrets, and involved in intimate aspects of their mistresses' lives. Among the servants themselves, a complete social world existed. Hierarchies in the staff mirrored those in the society they served. Senior servants maintained their dignity and distance from lower-level staff. Romance and rivalry played out in servants' halls and quarters. Small privileges, an afternoon off, permission to attend a local social event, a kind word from the housekeeper, these things mattered enormously in lives constrained by constant supervision and limited freedom. The question of dignity weighed on many servants. The work itself was not inherently degrading, service is honest labor, and many servants took genuine pride in their skills and the smooth functioning of the households they maintained. But the attitudes of employers often conveyed that servants were inferior beings, less intelligent, less sensitive, less deserving of consideration than those born to wealth and position. This casual dismissal of their humanity was perhaps the hardest thing to bear. Yet servants were not without agency or dignity. They could and did leave positions they found intolerable, though this required having somewhere else to go, and some savings to tide one over during the search for new employment. They could subtly resist or undermine employers they disliked, through foot-dragging, strategic incompetence, or the spreading of gossip. And they maintained their own values and perspectives, often viewing their employers with a mixture of deference, amusement, and skepticism. The servant question, as it was sometimes called, was a constant topic of conversation among Gold Coast families. Good servants were difficult to find, they complained, and even more difficult to keep. Young Americans increasingly rejected service as a career, preferring work in factories or offices that offered more freedom and dignity if not necessarily better pay. This meant that many Gold Coast households depended heavily on immigrant labor, particularly from Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe, creating a cosmopolitan character to the servants' world that contrasted with the Anglo-Saxon homogeneity of those they served. As we consider the labor that sustained the Gold Coast, we must recognize a fundamental contradiction. The life of leisure that the wealthy pursued was only possible because of the intensive labor of others. Every moment of effortless elegance required hours of behind-the-scenes work. The invisibility of this labor was essential to the fantasy, the illusion that beauty and comfort simply existed without cost or effort. Yet the servants themselves were always aware of the reality, that the paradise of the Gold Coast rested on their backs, and that the mansions and gardens they maintained were worlds they could never truly enter as anything other than workers. In 1925, Scott Fitzgerald published The Great Gatsby, a novel that would become inseparable from our understanding of the Gold Coast. Though Fitzgerald set his story on Long Island's North Shore, creating the fictional settlements of West Egg and East Egg, anyone familiar with the region recognized the territory he was mapping. The geography might be imagined, but the world he described was real, drawn from Fitzgerald's own observations of Gold Coast society during the early 1920s. The novel's power derives partly from its position as both insider and outsider perspective. Fitzgerald and his wife seldom moved in some of the same social circles as Gold Coast families, attending parties and staying as guests at various estates. Yet they were never truly of this world. Fitzgerald's Minnesota origins and his career as a writer, rather than as an inheritor or maker of industrial fortunes, marked him as an observer rather than a participant. This liminal position gave him the access necessary to understand the life he depicted and the distance necessary to see it clearly. The parties Fitzgerald described at Gatsby's mansion, with their orchestras and champagne, their catered food and casual mingling of guests who barely knew their host, were not inventions but amplified versions of actual Gold Coast entertainments. The scale might be exaggerated for dramatic effect, but the essential character was accurate. The casual expenditure of enormous sums, the blurring of boundaries between different social sets, the desperate quality underlying apparent celebration, these were real aspects of the life Fitzgerald observed. What Fitzgerald captured brilliantly was the essential hollowness at the heart of this world. His characters pursue pleasure and status with exhausting intensity, yet no amount of achievement seems to satisfy. Gatsby himself, with his mysterious fortune and his obsessive pursuit of a woman who represents everything he believes he wants, becomes a figure of tragic delusion. The novel suggests that the entire project of the Gold Coast, the attempt to create a paradise of wealth and leisure, rests on similarly shaky foundations. The East Egg versus West Egg distinction, representing old money and new money respectively, captured real tensions in Gold Coast society. The novel's suggestion that even vast wealth could not purchase true acceptance into the highest social circles reflected the actual experiences of many families. Tom and Daisy Buchanan, secure in their old money privilege, can behave with casual cruelty because they know their position is unassailable. Gatsby, for all his parties and possessions, remains an outsider trying desperately to penetrate a world that will never truly admit him. Publication of the novel created an interesting feedback loop. Fitzgerald's depiction of the Gold Coast became, for many readers, their primary image of this world. The novel's enduring popularity, particularly after Fitzgerald's death and its establishment as a classic of American literature, meant that generations of Americans understood the Gold Coast through Gatsby's eyes. The fictional version began to shape perception of the historical reality, not replacing it but coloring how we imagine and interpret it. The parties on the Gold Coast continued through the 1920s, the decade when Fitzgerald wrote and that the novel captured. This was the era of Prohibition, that fascinating American experiment in legislated morality that banned the production and sale of alcohol. For Gold Coast families, Prohibition was more annoyance than obstacle. Their wine cellars remained stocked from pre-Prohibition days, and connections with bootleggers ensured continued supply of spirits and champagne. The law might forbid alcohol to ordinary Americans, but such restrictions were not meant for those with the means and connections to circumvent them. The 1920s represented perhaps the peak of Gold Coast life, a final flowering before the catastrophe that would transform everything. The combination of Prohibition-era transgression, post-war optimism, and the speculative prosperity of the decade created a particular intensity. Parties grew larger and more elaborate. The social season extended longer. Young people of Gold Coast families became symbols of a new generation supposedly freed from old constraints, though in reality they remained largely bound by the same social rules that had governed their parents. Fitzgerald's novel appeared just 4 years before the stock market crash of 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression. Reading it now, knowing what came after, we can see prescience in its portrayal of a society living unsustainably, pursuing pleasures that could not ultimately satisfy, and built on foundations of inequality and moral emptiness that could not support the weight placed upon them. The green light at the end of Daisy's dock, which Gatsby stares at with such longing, becomes a symbol of all impossible American dreams, all the desires that wealth cannot fulfill. The relationship between the novel and the place it depicted remains complex. Fitzgerald was not writing sociology or history but literature, and his priorities were aesthetic and thematic rather than documentary. Yet the power of his work derives partly from its grounding in observed reality. The Gold Coast was the raw material from which he crafted his narrative, and his narrative has, in turn, become part of how we understand that historical reality. Today, tourists visit Long Island's North Shore looking for Gatsby's mansion, though of course it never existed. The fictional has become more vivid than the actual estates that inspired it. This is perhaps fitting, as the Gold Coast itself was always partly a fiction, a constructed fantasy of what the perfect life might look like if only one had sufficient money to build and maintain it. Fitzgerald saw through the fantasy while also being half entranced by it, and that double consciousness gives his novel its lasting power. The mythology that grew up around the Gold Coast, partly from Fitzgerald's novel but also from other sources, served various purposes. For some, it became a symbol of American achievement, proof that the nation could produce luxury and culture to rival any European aristocracy. For others, it represented everything wrong with American inequality, a concentration of wealth and privilege that mocked democratic ideals. Both interpretations contain truth, and the tension between them remains unresolved. What cannot be disputed is that Fitzgerald's novel became the most enduring artifact of Gold Coast culture, outlasting nearly all the actual mansions and certainly outlasting the social world that produced them. The irony is rich. A critique of this society, written by an outsider, becomes the thing we most associate with it. The Gold Coast families sought to build permanence through architecture and social position, but it was a novelist's words, critical of their world, that achieved the immortality they desired. No paradise lasts forever, and the Gold Coast decline, when it came, was precipitous. The elements that would dismantle this carefully constructed world had been gathering for years. But the crash of 1929 and the depression that followed transformed possibilities into realities. Within a generation, the majority of the great estates would be gone, demolished or converted to other purposes, and the way of life they represented would survive only in memory and literature. The stock market crash in October 1929 wiped out enormous amounts of paper wealth overnight. Families that had felt secure in their fortunes discovered that much of their wealth had been illusory, built on overvalued stocks and speculative bubbles. The crash did not immediately impoverish everyone, as some fortunes rested on more solid foundations, but it began a process of economic contraction that would eventually touch nearly every American, including those who had seemed most protected from economic vicissitudes. As the Depression deepened through the early 1930s, the costs of maintaining Gold Coast estates became increasingly difficult to justify or sustain. These properties had always been expensive, requiring constant infusions of money for upkeep, staff wages, taxes, and general maintenance. When income from investments disappeared or dramatically decreased, these expenses became impossible to meet. Families that had employed 50 servants found themselves cutting back to 20, then 10, then perhaps just a skeleton staff to watch over properties no longer fully inhabited. The symbolic weight of these estates shifted during the Depression. What had once represented achievement and success now began to seem like shameful excess. When millions of Americans were unemployed, hungry, and losing their homes, the maintenance of 100-room mansions and vast estates appeared not just extravagant, but morally indefensible. Some families kept their estates but lowered their profiles, entertaining less ostentatiously and becoming more aware of how their privilege appeared to the struggling nation around them. Taxation played a significant role in the estate's decline. The income tax, which had been relatively modest for the wealthy in the early decades of the 20th century, increased substantially during the 1930s and especially during World War II, as the government sought revenue to fund New Deal programs and later the war effort. Estate taxes also increased, making it more difficult to pass these properties intact from one generation to the next. What had seemed like family patrimony, expected to continue through generations, suddenly became unsustainable burdens that heirs were eager to shed. World War II accelerated all these trends. Young men from Gold Coast families enlisted or were drafted, experiencing the war in close proximity with Americans from all backgrounds. This shared experience of military service, while not eliminating class distinctions, made them seem less absolute. The war economy created labor shortages that made servants increasingly difficult to find, even for families with money to pay them. Many people who might once have entered domestic service found better paying opportunities in war industries. The post-war world that emerged after 1945 was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before 1929. American society had become more democratic in sensibility, less tolerant of extreme displays of inequality. The tax structure made accumulation of Gold Coast-level wealth more difficult, and maintenance of such estates more expensive. Perhaps most importantly, the values had shifted. The next generation of wealthy Americans, while still privileged, generally preferred to display that privilege differently, through things like multiple homes of moderate size rather than single vast estates, through consumption of luxury goods rather than maintenance of extensive grounds and large staffs. The practical difficulties were immense. The mansions themselves, built without thought to operating costs, were expensive to heat, to light, to clean, and to repair. As building systems aged, as roofs needed replacement, as foundations shifted and required attention, the costs mounted. Many families found themselves trapped, unable to maintain properties but also unable to sell them, as there were few buyers willing to take on such white elephants. One by one, the great estates met various fates. Some were demolished entirely, the valuable materials salvaged and the land subdivided for more modest development. The demolition of these architectural treasures proceeded with heartbreaking regularity through the 1940s and 1950s, as elaborate interiors were stripped and structures that had cost millions to build were knocked down for a fraction of that amount. Marble mantels, carved paneling, crystal chandeliers, all were sold off piecemeal or simply destroyed. Other estates found second lives through institutional use. Schools, colleges, hospitals, and various non-profit organizations took over properties, adapting them to new purposes. These conversions at least preserved the buildings, though often with alterations that compromised their original design. A mansion might be divided into classrooms or dormitories, with drop ceilings and industrial carpeting obscuring elaborate plasterwork and parquet floors. But preservation in any form was preferable to destruction. A few estates survived in something approaching their original condition, maintained by families with sufficient continued wealth and determination to meet the challenges. These survivors became increasingly rare treasures, examples of a way of life and architectural approach that had largely vanished. Some were eventually donated and became museums, allowing the public to tour spaces that had once been rigorously private, to walk through rooms where the Gold Coast families had entertained and lived their extraordinary lives. The servants who had maintained these estates also experienced displacement. As properties closed or reduced their staff, long-time employees found themselves searching for new positions in a market with decreasing demand for their skills. Some adapted, finding work in the hotels and clubs that represented a more commercial version of the service they had provided. Others left domestic service entirely, seeking employment in the changing post-war economy. Their departure represented the loss not just of jobs but of expertise, as the skills required to properly run a Gold Coast estate, once passed down through generations of service families, gradually disappeared. The children and grandchildren of the Gold Coast families often felt relief at the passing of this world. They had grown up surrounded by luxury but also burdened by expectation and social obligation. The freedom to live less formal lives, to marry based on personal preference rather than social calculation, to pursue careers that interested them rather than simply managing inherited wealth, these possibilities appealed to many who might have been expected to mourn the old ways most deeply. Yet there remained a sense of loss, even among those who recognized the problems inherent in the Gold Coast world. Something beautiful had been created, however flawed its foundations. The architecture, the gardens, the craftsmanship, these represented genuine achievements. The social rituals, while exclusionary and often superficial, had also created communities and traditions. The dissolution of this world meant the loss not just of physical structures but of knowledge, skills, and ways of living that, whatever their limitations, had been part of American culture. By the 1960s and 1970s, the transformation was largely complete. The Gold Coast as a coherent social world had ceased to exist. The north shore of Long Island remained affluent, and some impressive houses still stood, but the concentration of extreme wealth, the elaborate social structure, the armies of servants, the constant round of formal entertaining, all of this had become history. The land itself remained beautiful, but it had been substantially transformed, carved into suburbs and institutional campuses, crossed by highways, integrated into the broader patterns of American development. What remained was memory, and the question of what the Gold Coast had meant, and what its rise and fall told us about America itself. As we reach the end of our journey through the Gold Coast, we're left with questions that resist simple answers. What should we make of this extraordinary chapter in American history? Was it a glorious achievement, or a shameful display of inequality? Did it represent the best of what American capitalism could produce, or the worst? Perhaps the answer is that it was all of these things simultaneously, a complicated legacy that continues to resonate more than half a century after the world it represented essentially ceased to exist. The physical traces remain, though diminished. Some estates still stand, converted to schools or museums or, in rare cases, still maintained as private homes by families with the resources and desire to do so. The visitor today can walk through rooms where Gold Coast families entertained, can see the craftsmanship that went into elaborate fireplaces and carved ceilings, can stand on terraces overlooking the Sound and imagine the views that drew the wealthy here more than a century ago. These preserved spaces function as time capsules, offering glimpses into vanished ways of living. The gardens, where they survive, tell their own stories. The Olmsted firm's plantings have matured beyond anything the original designers might have imagined, creating landscapes of great beauty even when no longer maintained to Gold Coast standards. Walking through these gardens, one can appreciate the vision that created them while also recognizing the armies of gardeners required to maintain them in their original perfect condition. Nature, left somewhat more to its own devices, has created its own kind of beauty from these designed landscapes. The social structures that the Gold Coast represented have also evolved rather than simply disappearing. Wealth remains concentrated in America, often in patterns that would seem familiar to Gold Coast families. The mechanisms of social exclusion continue, though often more subtle than the explicit barriers of the earlier era. The desire of the wealthy to create separate spaces, protected from the rest of society, manifests in gated communities and exclusive neighborhoods even if not in vast estates with dozens of servants. Yet something has genuinely changed. The confidence with which Gold Coast families constructed their world, the sense that they were creating something permanent and legitimate, this particular quality has not been replicated. Modern American wealth, however great, tends to present itself more defensively, more aware of its need for justification. The cultural authority that the Gold Coast families claimed has been dispersed, challenged, and in many ways demolished. No one today could build a 100-room mansion without confronting questions about appropriateness and social responsibility that would never have occurred to Otto Kahn or the Vanderbilts. The servants' descendants also lived different lives now. The dignity of labor that they sought and often struggled to maintain has become more widely recognized, even if economic inequality persists. The service economy that replaced domestic service in many ways offers both more and less than the old system, more freedom and formal rights, perhaps, but often less job security and personal connection. The relationship between those who serve and those who are served remains complex and often uncomfortable, a continuing negotiation about value and respect. For those of us who contemplate the Gold Coast from the distance of time, it offers a kind of mirror in which we can examine our own values and assumptions. What do we admire? The beauty of the architecture and landscapes, the craftsmanship and artistry, the moments of genuine culture and achievement that occurred within this world. What do we criticize? The extreme inequality, the social exclusions, the waste, the disconnection from the realities that most Americans experienced. The Gold Coast was both beautiful and problematic, and wrestling with that duality teaches us something about the nature of human achievement and limitation. F. Scott Fitzgerald, who gave us our most lasting image of this world, wrote in The Great Gatsby that the rich are different from you and me. The Gold Coast certainly tried to prove that proposition, creating an entire landscape and social structure based on the assumption of fundamental difference between those with extreme wealth and everyone else. Yet the history of the Gold Coast also demonstrates the limits of such difference. The rich were still subject to economic forces, to historical change, to death and time. Their mansions crumbled or were demolished. Their social structures dissolved. The permanence they sought eluded them. What persists is not the thing itself but the image of it, preserved in photographs and novels, in the few surviving estates, and the stories passed down through families who lived there or worked there. These images continue to fascinate us, perhaps because they represent a kind of extreme, a vision of what wealth could create when essentially unconstrained by taxation, regulation, or social criticism. We look back at the Gold Coast with a mixture of wonder and horror, attracted and repelled by the same qualities. The land itself continues as land does. The hills still roll down to Long Island Sound. The water still reflects the changing sky. The seasons turn, bringing the spring blooms and autumn colors that the Gold Coast families enjoyed. Houses stand on the same ground where mansions once stood, though these houses are more modest, more numerous, more democratic in their distribution. The North Shore has moved on, integrated into the broader patterns of suburban American life, while still retaining traces of its extraordinary past. As we close this exploration, we might take a moment to simply sit with the strangeness of it all. For a brief period, measured in decades rather than centuries, this stretch of Long Island coast became home to a concentration of wealth and privilege that created an entire world, complete with its own architecture, social rules, daily rhythms, and assumptions about life and meaning. That world rose, flourished, and fell within the span of a long human lifetime. Someone born when the first estates were being built might have lived to see the last demolished, experiencing within a single life the entire arc of the Gold Coast story. There is something both sobering and oddly comforting in this impermanence. Even the mighty fall. Even the most carefully constructed paradises cannot protect themselves from history's relentless motion. The families of the Gold Coast learned, as all humans must, that nothing lasts forever, that all our constructions are temporary, that time claims everything eventually. Yet, while it lasted, it was remarkable. Flawed, certainly. Unjust, undoubtedly. But also beautiful, ambitious, and in its own way, very human, an attempt to create perfection knowing full well that perfection cannot be achieved but trying anyway. The story of the Gold Coast is ultimately an American story, about possibility and excess, achievement and inequality, beauty and blindness. It reminds us of what we can create, and what we should perhaps think twice about creating. It shows us both the power of wealth and its ultimate insufficiency to provide meaning or permanence. The mansions are gone, or nearly so. The social world has dissolved. The servants have departed. But the story remains, preserved in memory and telling us still about who we were, and perhaps, who we are.